The Isle of Scarp, Outer Hebrides, Saturday, 28 July, 1934, shortly after 7 in the morning. Norman McCaskill, 43, had been rowing the mailbag across this half-mile of tidal water between the island of Scarp and the shore of Harris for 11 years, and on this particular morning, he was crossing earlier than usual, before the crowd that was expected on the beach later in the day. The bag sat wrapped in oilskin under the thwart. 4 letters, a copy of the Stornoway Gazette, and a small parcel for the McLennan Croft. He knew the Kyle the way another man might know the streets of his own town, where the current ran hardest on the ebb, where a boat could be set onto the rocks below Sronrummel if a man misjudged the wind coming down off the hill. He did not know, rowing across that morning, that within a few hours a German engineer would attempt to send the same half-mile of water by rocket in 10 seconds, or that by early afternoon the beach he had just left would be scattered with scorched paper and the smell of spent fuel. He knew only that the tide was right, that the crossing would take him a little under 20 minutes, and that the bag under the thwart would arrive, whether or not anyone on Harris happened to be watching the water that day. By mid-morning, the beach at Scarp was no longer the beach Norman McCaskill had left. A crowd had gathered, islanders in working clothes and flat caps, visiting journalists with folding cameras, and the district's head postmaster, whose presence lent the proceedings a degree of official weight that a private stunt could not otherwise have claimed. At the center of it stood a meter-long rocket, its cartridge packed with letters, mounted on a timber launch rig with a coil of ignition wire trailing back to a wooden firing box. Beside it stood a German inventor named Gerhard Zucker, who believed he was about to demonstrate something that would make Norman McCaskill's 11 years on the water obsolete by that afternoon. A rocket that could do in 10 seconds what the tide, the current, and a rowing man had always required 20 minutes to accomplish. Scarp itself gave the demonstration its stage, almost by accident of geography. The island sat little more than half a mile from Harris across a channel the islanders called the Cowlus. Narrow enough to look, on a calm day, almost swimmable, and yet reliably impassable in bad weather for days at a stretch. It was precisely the kind of place Zucker had been searching for, remote enough that its isolation was self-evident, and narrow enough that a rocket, if it worked, could prove the point in a single visible afternoon rather than over a longer, harder-to-photograph distance. Before you can understand why a rocket came to Scarp at all, you need to understand what island isolation meant to the British postal authorities in 1934, and what one particular family's ordeal had just made painfully visible to the national press. 6 months before the launch, a Scarp woman named Christy McLennan went into a difficult labor with twins. Bad weather delayed help. She gave birth to 1 child at home, then had to be taken by boat across the Kyle, by horse cart, and finally by bus to hospital in Stornoway, where she delivered the second child 2 days later and 50 miles from where the first had been born. The story made national headlines, and it was, for Gerhard Zucker's purposes, close to perfect. Proof that a remote British community still depended on transport that could take 2 days to cover 50 miles. Zucker was not improvising. He arrived in Britain in 1934, already an established rocket experimenter, backed by the stamp dealer C.H. Dombrowski's considerable private funding, and represented by a press agent, Robert Hartman, who had secured an exclusive arrangement with the Daily Express. Earlier that summer, a smaller test on the Sussex Downs had gone well enough to generate newspaper coverage. Scarp, with its half-mile strait and its freshly newsworthy isolation, was the obvious next stage. A chance to show that a system entirely independent of Norman McCaskill's boat and of the tides that governed it could deliver a British Islands post in 10 seconds instead of 20 minutes. What the rocket asked the public to imagine was a post office no longer answerable to weather, current, or the physical limits of a man in a rowing boat. What the ordinary crossing had already spent decades proving was that none of those limits had ever stopped the post from arriving. Zucker's ambitions were larger than a single Hebridean beach. He spoke, in the weeks before Scarp, of postal rocket bridges linking island-dotted nations, Denmark, Canada, Scotland itself, and of a proposed 1-minute rocket crossing of the channel between Dover and Calais, a plan he had already been pitching directly to the General Post Office in London. Scarp was not the destination. It was the demonstration meant to unlock the rest. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail, between 1,900 and 1,980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans or romantic invention. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it delivered or failed to deliver. What Norman McCaskill knew about the half-mile of water between Scarp and Harris. A rocket fired once was never going to learn in an afternoon. And if a rocket mail cover, a Highland mailboat memory, or a family story about a remote posting has ever come down to you, tell us in the comments. Next on this channel, the postman who kept the Pennine rounds moving on foot through the snow of the 1947 winter, when no van and no bicycle could get through at all. Back on the beach at Scarp, 11 years on, the Isle of Scarp had given Norman McCaskill a kind of knowledge that appeared nowhere in any post office instruction book. He knew which of the crofting families on Scarp watched for the boat from their windows, and which did not bother to look up until he was hauling it onto the shingle. He knew that the McLennan Croft, still recovering from the difficult winter of Christie's confinement, would want the parcel handed directly to a family member rather than left. He knew the specific danger points of the crossing by name, the run of water below Sron Rummel, the shallow ledge that could strand a boat at low tide, because he had misjudged them himself. More than once, in his first 2 years on the route, he knew, without needing to be told, that a mailbag delivered a few minutes late on a morning when the tide was against him mattered less to the people on Scarp than a mailbag delivered wet, or a parcel handed over roughly. None of this knowledge had been designed. It had accumulated, crossing by crossing, the way any experienced rural postal worker's knowledge of a round accumulates. Not from a manual, but from the specific, repeated encounter with the same water, the same currents, and the same handful of households, until the work and the place became, in his hands, indistinguishable from each other. A rocket did not have 11 years. It had one afternoon, one test firing, and one German inventor's confidence that engineering could substitute for exactly the kind of accumulated, embodied knowledge that Norman McCaskill carried in his forearms every time he adjusted for the current below the rocks. This was the specific asymmetry the afternoon's demonstration was about to expose, though almost nobody standing on the beach yet understood it that way. There was, too, a kind of knowledge Norman McCaskill held that had nothing to do with currents at all. The knowledge of who on Scarp was waiting for what. He knew that the household nearest the shore road had a daughter working in service in Glasgow who wrote twice a month, reliably, on the same day each time. He knew that the family, recovering from the winter's difficult confinement, wanted news handled gently, handed over, rather than dropped through a door. None of this was written down anywhere the post office kept records. It existed only in the accumulated attention of a man who had rowed the same half-mile of water to the same handful of houses several thousand times. The cartridge Zucker's team loaded that morning held around 1,200 covers, each bearing a specially printed stamp, reading Western Isles Rocket Post, sold in advance at 2 shillings and 6pence to collectors and well-wishers who wanted a piece of the demonstration, whether or not they had any correspondence that actually needed to cross the Kyle. For most of the people who had bought one, the stamp was not really about getting a letter to Harris. It was about owning a fragment of a moment that felt, in July 1934, like the future arriving early, proof that a person had been present, on paper, at the exact instant an old problem was solved by a new machine, that the letters themselves were, for the most part, ordinary. Greetings, souvenirs, notes to friends, rather than urgent correspondence, mattered less than what buying a place on the rocket represented. Islanders queued alongside visiting collectors and journalists to have their covers included, each one a small act of faith in Zucker's claim that the half-mile between Scarp and Harris could be crossed in 10 seconds rather than 20 minutes. Nobody buying a stamp that morning was thinking about currents, or tides, or the particular danger of the ledge below Sron Rommel. They were buying into a demonstration, and the demonstration had been built, deliberately, around the fact that Britain's most talked about isolated island had just spent a national news cycle proving how badly it needed exactly this kind of solution. What none of the 1,200 letters could carry, however carefully they were addressed, was any guarantee that the rocket itself would survive the crossing it had been built to make. Some accounts of the day put the number of covers that came through the first explosion relatively intact at around 793 out of the 1,200 loaded, a figure worth treating with some caution since it does not appear consistently across every source, but one that gives a rough sense of how much of the cargo the fire actually claimed. What is not in dispute is that the letters which did survive, scorched at the edges or otherwise marked by the blast, would go on to matter more to collectors precisely because of what had happened to them, rather than in spite of it. At a little after 2 in the afternoon, Gerhard Zucker pressed the electric starter switch on the launch rig set up on the Scarp side of the Kyle. There was a dull explosion and a flash of flame, and within a second, the rocket and its cartridge of 1,200 letters had disintegrated on or near the beach rather than crossing the water toward Harris. When the smoke cleared, the launch apparatus lay shattered, and the sand around it was scattered with smouldering, blackened envelopes, some scorched at the edges, some little more than ash, a handful intact enough that the address was still legible. The head postmaster, who had come to observe an official demonstration of a new postal technology, was instead watching several hundred pieces of Royal Mail correspondence burn on a public beach. Zucker attributed the failure to a fault in the fuel and insisted, immediately, that the experiment be repeated. For public safety, the second attempt was moved off Scarp entirely, to the grounds of Amhuinnsuidhe Castle on the Harris side, where a shorter demonstration flight, no longer required to cross open water, could be staged without endangering the crowd a second time. On 31 July, 3 days later, that rocket exploded as well, scattering its own cargo of mail across the castle grounds in a spray that one newspaper described as coming down like confetti, the letters again scorched and blackened with smoke. 2 consecutive failures, in front of witnesses that now included Royal Mail officials directly, had answered the question. The beach at Scarp had gathered to watch settled that afternoon, though not in the direction Zucker had hoped. For the islanders who had queued to buy a stamp and watched their letters burn in front of them, the experience was less a scientific disappointment than a small, sharply felt loss. A handful walked the tide line afterward, picking scorched envelopes out of the sand by hand, checking addresses where the paper had survived enough to be read at all. A task no one had assigned them, and one the rocket's designer had not thought to plan for. The authorities' patience did not survive the second explosion. Home Office officials, who had been monitoring the demonstrations with a mixture of curiosity and concern from the start, now had 2 consecutive failures on record, an official witness to both, and a foreign national whose invention had twice put a Royal Mail postal shipment into the fire in front of the national press. The concern was not only safety. A rocket that could not reliably deliver its cargo intact was also, in the post office's own accounting, a risk to postal revenue and to the basic public trust that a stamped letter, once posted, would arrive. Zucker made one further attempt that December, launching from Lymington in Hampshire toward the Isle of Wight, a shorter, calmer crossing of the Solent, and a chance to salvage the project's credibility on English rather than Hebridean ground. The rocket fired cleanly this time and covered its short flight in a matter of seconds. A gust of wind caught it off course before it reached open water, and it came down, buckled, 3 feet deep in the mud of Pennington Marsh. A failure of navigation rather than combustion, but a failure all the same. Later that year, following the deportation proceedings that removed him from Britain, Zucker returned to Germany, where he was arrested on suspicion of having cooperated with the British authorities during his time in the Hebrides. 3 attempts, 3 failures, and a British postal system that had never, at any point in the summer or winter of 1934, stopped delivering the actual mail to Scarp by the method it had always used. Zucker's later history only sharpened the contrast between the drama of the demonstration and the quiet reliability of what it had been meant to replace. Back in Germany, he would go on working with rockets for another 3 decades, largely apart from the state rocket programs that would eventually produce weapons rather than mail deliveries. His name survives today, mainly in philatelic catalogues and in the archives of the institutions that watched him fail twice on a Hebridean beach and once in a Hampshire marsh. A. Inventor, remembered for the spectacle of failure rather than for any working system that outlasted him. On the Monday morning after the second explosion, Norman McCaskill rowed the Isle of Scarp exactly as he had rowed it the Saturday before, and every working day for 11 years before that. There was no crowd on the beach this time, no head postmaster, no press agent's exclusive arrangement with a national newspaper. There was a mailbag under the thwart, a tide he had already read correctly, and a handful of households on Scarp who expected their letters to arrive because they always had. Nothing about the previous week's spectacle had changed what the crossing required of him, and nothing about its failure had made his work more urgent than it already was. This is the part of the story that the newspapers covering Zucker's rockets had little reason to print. That the actual postal needs of Scarp, the parcel for the McLennan-Croft, the letters for the families still recovering from a hard winter, the ordinary correspondence of an island community, had continued to be met, without interruption, by exactly the system the rocket had been built to replace. The boat did not need to prove it could cross the Kyle in 10 seconds. It only needed to keep crossing it, reliably, in whatever time the tide required, which is precisely what it had done through 2 explosions and a marsh landing that made national headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with whether Scarp's mail arrived. What the rocket had promised was speed. What the boat had already delivered, for as long as anyone on the island could remember, was certainty. And certainty, on a half-mile of tidal water beneath a hill called Sron Rummel, had turned out to matter rather more than the 10 seconds anyone had been asked to imagine saving. There is a version of this story that treats the explosion as the interesting part, and the boat crossing that continued around it as background noise. The operational record suggests the opposite emphasis. The rocket appeared once, made national headlines twice, and left the Hebrides for good before the year was out. The boat crossing that Norman McCaskill and men like him had operated appears in no headline at all, because a crossing that never fails does not, by its nature, generate news. It generates only the ordinary continuity of a community that could still get its letters, its parcels, and its newspaper, whether or not anyone outside the island had ever heard of Scarp. The letters that survived the Scarp explosion, scorched at the edges, some barely legible, did not vanish into a footnote. Collectors kept them, then traded them, then, decades later, sold them at auction alongside photographs of the explosion itself, some bearing Zucker's own signature. What had been intended as proof of a working postal rocket became, instead, a collectible record of the moment it failed. The burnt cover, not the 10-second crossing, is what survives in the archives and the sale room today. Scarp itself did not need a rocket to end. Its population, already in slow decline through the 1930s, continued to fall in the decades after Zucker left. The island's primary school closed in 1967. Its post office, the actual one, the one the boat had served without interruption through the entire summer of 1934, closed the following year. In 1968, by the end of 1971, the last permanent residents had left for Harris, and the crossing Norman McCaskill had known by feel for 11 years became, For the first time since crofting families settled Scarp in 1810, a crossing nobody needed to make on any regular schedule at all. The rocket was never revisited as a serious post office option in the Hebrides or anywhere else in Britain. The mail that continued to reach Scarp until the post office closed did so by exactly the method it always had. A boat, a tide, and a man who knew both well enough not to need an explosion to prove it. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more remote crossings where the system that actually worked was never the one that made the headlines. The rocket promised to cross half a mile of water in 10 seconds. The boat had already been doing it, reliably, for as long as anyone on Scarp could remember. And it kept doing it the following Monday, whether or not anyone had been watching the beach the day before. And if you or your family have kept an old cover, a stamp, or a story from a remote posting route, a mailboat, an island crossing, a rural round, put it in the comments. Next on this channel, the postmen who kept the Pennine rounds moving on foot through the snow of the 1947 winter, when no van and no bicycle could get through at all. Norman McCaskill kept the Scarp crossing until 1945, when a younger man took over the route. The post office on Scarp closed in 1968. The last islanders left in 1971. What the rocket left behind: a handful of scorched envelopes, now in collector's albums, and 2 photographs of an explosion on a beach. What the boat left behind: 40 years of a crossing that never once made the newspapers, because it never once failed to arrive.